Now we're going to talk about another very successful woman artist of the Renaissance. And as you can see, she's a little bit younger than Sophonisba, and in fact, oftentimes there were references made to, to her trying to emulate Sophonisba. But she's very alike in the sense that she has to, show that she's proper, and she has to please aristocrats and things. But she's very different in that she is not an aristocrat, although she kind of takes on that persona. We'll see how this works. Lavinia Fontana was the daughter and the only child of the Bolognese painter Prospero Fontana. Now, if she'd been a boy, there'd been no question. She'd been trained by her father to be, trained by her father to be a painter. But she's the only child, right? And the father seems to be quite forward-thinking, and he decides that he will train his daughter and arrange her career. I'm sure that some of that is concern for his daughter, and some of it is concern for himself. When he gets old, who's going to support him? And who's going to support her? Well, we'll see how this all works. So she is trained by her father to have a career as an artist, and she's promoted. He is very interested in her skill and having it known and having commissions for her. This is, both because he wants his daughter to be successful, and undoubtedly he wants himself to have the benefits when he's in his old age and can no longer support himself, that his daughter will be able to do it. And they won't be just dependent on whoever her husband might be. In fact, the fathers generally arranged marriages for their daughters at this time. And in 1577, she was married. It was an arranged marriage with one of her father's pupils, Gian Paolo Zappi. Now, when the father made this marriage, he made it some conditions. He wasn't going to marry his daughter to anybody who would take her away. And that's probably one reason he picks a pupil, because then the pupil knows that, eventually, the workshop will become the daughter's. So he continual work there. At any rate, the father arranges the marriage with his pupil, Zappi, on the condition that the couple live with the father, and Lavinia continues to work. And that seems to be satisfactory to everybody. One of the interesting things is Zappi evidently wasn't as good an artist as Lavinia. And he eventually becomes an assistant. Some people even suggest that he helps take care of the household. I don't know about that at all. She has 11 children. Now, not all of those survive to adulthood. Some of them survive into teenage years or whatever. Only 3 of them survive their mother. But she's having to support, later on, when her father gets older, him. She supports her husband, she supports herself, and she supports however many of her children, say 4 or more, are living. So she's the support of the family. And one of the things I keep wondering is how, with 11 children, even with 4 children, she would have had time to do this. Now, presumably, she's quite successful. We'll see this in her pictures. And she has nursemaids to take care of the children. Zappi becomes, we said, her assistant. He probably does, puts on backgrounds and grinds paint and things like that. He also becomes her business manager. And this makes a lot of sense, because a lot of times women are not allowed to make contracts without father or husband approval. So if he's her business manager, that works out beautifully. Her patrons include nobles of all kinds, but particularly noble ladies. Once again, there is that idea of if you have yourself portrayed by a woman artist, your reputation is completely intact. But even cardinals and popes collect her work. At some point, they also actually moved from Bologna, to Rome, because a lot of their patronage is there. And a couple of fairly famous names is Cardinal Scipione Borghese and Pope Paul V. Scipione Borghese, some of you may know as the patron of Bernini in his 20s. The Bernini David, the Pluto and Persephone, Apollo and Daphne, and of course portrait busts of Cardinal Scipione Borghese by Bernini are terribly well known. So the same man is patronizing, is buying pictures from Lavinia Fontana, as is the Pope. I've been using this portrait medal of Lavinia Fontana to show you, and this of course was done very, very late in her life after she'd had all of her fame, but it's kind of interesting because they have this portrait medal created in honor of Lavinia Fontana from 1611, and you have, of course, the classical bust portrait, which comes down to us from classical antiquity, and you'd have coins with the emperors in the profile, and the Renaissance starts continuing on that tradition. And then on the back you have an allegory. And you see this female figure. Is it a portrait or is it just a generalized female figure? Hard to tell because it's quite small. But it's a female figure of a woman who is painting, probably a personification of painting. And she has this wild Medusa-like hair. They're not snakes, it's just hair going out in an artistic frenzy. So this is supposed to symbolize the divine inspiration or the genius of the artist. Genius of the artist, that is an idea that grew up during the Renaissance. And here Lavinia Fontana is at the later part of the Renaissance in the era of mannerism. And by this time, it has been at least established in Italy among noble circles that great artists can be divinely inspired just like poets, and they can be recognized as geniuses. Usually we think of people like Raphael or Michelangelo as being the ones, but here it's the idea that Lavinia Fontana has some genius as well. One of the interesting things about her is she seems to be the first woman in Catholic Europe to paint large altarpieces systematically. We saw that Katharina von Hamessen may have contributed to some altarpieces, but we know that Lavinia Fontana actively sought these commissions and did a number of large altarpieces. She also, it's kind of interesting, obviously male and female artists are doing Marian paintings, but it's always interesting to see how a woman interprets them. So she also does, Mary as the subject. And she has been associated, her religious art has been associated with the idea of Counter-Reformation piety and decorum. I need to say a little bit about that. The Council of Trent in the middle of the 16th century made a number of declarations and decrees, and they made one very short, small one, about art. And they said that basically a religious art should be decorous, which meant that it should be appropriate to the subject. This is the time when a pope calls in Daniele Voltari to paint breeches on Michelangelo's Last Judgment because there's just too much naked genitals and buttocks and other things hanging out in the Pope's chapel, the Sistine Chapel, and that's not decorous, although, let's face it, at the Last Judgment, who's wearing clothes? But it was, they had Daniele Voltari now became known as the breeches painter because he painted breeches and loincloths and cloth all over Michelangelo's painting. They were very concerned that the art be appropriate to the subject and to the doctrine, and that any extra things in it, once again, be appropriate. You may have heard the story about Veronese, who paints this huge Last Supper. I mean, I think it's 42 feet wide. It's just gigantic. And he's put in extras, He's got dogs and buffoons and just, all sorts of people that would be at a rich person's feast. And he gets called into the Inquisition, and they say, this is not decorous, it's not appropriate for a painting of the sacrament, you've got to change it. Well, there's no way he can change this humongous painting, which probably took him years to do, so he changes the name. He writes a Bible verse, he writes, I think, was it Luke 25, whatever it is. But it says, now it's no longer the Last Supper, it's the feast in the house of Simon. He's a rich man, he's allowed to have all this stuff. That seemed to satisfy the Venetians. I don't know if it was satisfied the Spanish, but it was satisfied the Venetians, and that's what he had to worry about. But the point that I'm trying to make with these little stories is that they wanted art to be proper in a certain sense. And I don't necessarily mean that you couldn't have nude figures, but they had to be appropriate. They weren't supposed to attract lewd and lascivious thought. Now, that said, we're talking about religious painting. As you'll see, that the rule was not for, say, classical art. You could be as lascivious as you want with that, but religious art. Okay. We're looking at a picture of the Holy Family with Saints Margaret, who is kneeling, in the lower left as we look at it, and Saint Francis, who is right above her, looking at the Christ child, or actually he's looking at a crucifix, sort of in the direction of the Christ child. And then, of course, there's Saint Joseph, and then Mary and the baby Jesus in this kind of cradle, sarcophagus, manger, whatever it is. It looks like it could be rocked, so I guess it looks like classical cradle of some kind. It is appropriate in every bit because it shows the motherly love of the Virgin. The people who are there are saints and they're behaving properly. You see a really interesting combination of styles in Lavinia Fontana. Many times she's using mannerist elegance, these elongated figures with poses that we sometimes feel are somewhat mannered, but that would be what was considered appropriate for the time. For example, here where Margaret is kneeling and crossing her hands over her breast. But this is a show of piety. She is adoring the Christ child. And so we have this mannerist elegance, and you can see that particularly, I think, in Mary. Also, the details are very, very naturalistic. So this was the same thing that, you remember, Sofonisba sought to have a lot of wonderful details in clothing and costumes, and Lavinia Fontana, as we'll see, does this as well. But also, the details can be in religious pictures as well. Christ child is very, very lively, as you can see. It looks like he's going to wiggle right out of his mother's arms, and he is blessing the saint who is kneeling before him. Now, this, of course, is a picture showing piety of the saints and probably showing us how we should behave and how we should give our devotion to Christ and to his mother, as the viewer. But it has been suggested that this may have a personal meaning for Lavinia Fontana. She had conceived 2 children in the first year of marriage, and they both died. So her first 2 children died. And Saint Margaret, you see below, is the patron saint of childbirth. And she is the person that you call upon to help you through childbirth and also to help, that your children will live. So maybe she is evoking Saint Margaret in the hope that there will be future children who will live. Saint Francis isn't directly associated with childbirth, but he is contemplating a crucifix, which of course refers to the death of Christ, but also the resurrection. So perhaps, it's been suggested this painting combines elements of birth and death. And Christ child, of course, is by Christian theology, would be the incarnate God who is born into human flesh and dies on the cross to save all mankind, including her 2 deceased children. So, there is a possible personal reference in this picture. Here is, Lavinia Fontana didn't do as many self-portraits as Sofonisba Aguisola, but she did do some. And here is one of the self-portraits. from 1577. This would have been done just before her marriage, presumably, because she styles herself a Virgo. So she signed it, she's dated it, Lavinia Virgo, Lavinia Virgin, Prospero, which would be, of course, her name, Fontana, Filia, so Lavinia Virgin, daughter of Prospero Fontana. And then she says, ex speculo imagine. From the mirror, I imaged it. Sorry for the rough translation there, but she's talking about she created this from looking in a mirror. And then she also gives us the date of 1577. So in her inscription, she tells us that she is a virgin. She tells us that she's the daughter of Prospero Fontana. So she is asserting her propriety. She is bringing in her family connection. And she also has that same motif that we've seen before, the idea that since she's painted her image from a mirror, you can think back to the classical artist or Marcia, who also painted her image from a mirror. Now, to me, it always seems like the spacing of this seems a little awkward, and you'll see that sometimes she does have some awkward spacing in her complex pictures. Other times, it works out beautifully. But here she's at this very high point of view, and I wonder if the high point of view, which seems a little awkward to me, is really to show us things. We're looking down on the keyboard, so we can see she's playing that keyboard instrument, the virginals. She's looking down on her maidservant holding the music open. She's accomplished in music as well as painting. And in the background, this little alcove with a window, and there sits the easel that testifies that she is a painter. So, like Sophonisba Aguisola, Lavinia Fontana styles herself as a chaste young woman who's playing the virginals. She is chaperoned, and this is presumably before her marriage, which took place in June of 1577. Lavinia's clothing seems to be much more elaborate. It may be that styles are changing and becoming more elaborate. It also may be that Lavinia felt that she had to insist visually on her status. She is from the middle class. She's an artist. She has to work for a living. She is not of noble blood the way Sophonisba's family, even if they were recently noble, they were noble. And so Lavinia, however, is dealing with people who are noble, and she has to fit in. So she styles herself a lady of leisure who can leave her easel and go and make music on her clavichord or spinet or whichever musical instrument it is. And she's dressing in a way that would be thought of as an aristocratic, noble woman. So Sophonisba can dress a little more simply. She doesn't have to perhaps show all the embroidery and things. Maybe also that her Lavinia is about to get married, so that will also ensure that she has a position in society. This is a self-portrait that's a bit later. It's smaller, and I think in some ways it's certainly much more accomplished, certainly the spatial relationships here. Self-portrait in a studio in a round, it's painted on copper, really precious material to paint on. And it's 6 1/4 inches in diameter. Now, this was a request. One of the things that people would do is they would have in their studies paintings of famous men or sometimes famous women. And Alfonso Chacon, who was a Spanish Dominican and was a collector, he requested from Lavinia a portrait that he wanted to place near his portrait of Sophonisba Aguisola. which would be placed in his collection of paintings of famous men and at least two famous women, Sophonisba and Lavinia Fontana. So you can see that that parallel is being made of these unusual women artists who are, have a good deal of fame at their time. We're looking at her Lavinia Fontana's self-portrait in a studio from 1579. And she's seated at the desk, drawing. The pose is like a scholar writing. Now, she's in a studio. And in the background, you see all of these antique statues and bits of statuary. And it has been suggested that where she's portraying herself is her father's studio. Because her father was supposed to have kept collections of antiquities and curiosities. So by placing her, not showing her actually painting, she's drawing, but he's placing her in this kind of position in a study with classical and possibly Renaissance sculpture, little statuettes, that it is suggesting her learning and her link to classical antiquity. Now, how much real learning she had, I don't know, but she's poised that way. And once again, she's wearing this beautiful clothing with this wonderful ruff and pattern sleeve, which would make her fit right in with the aristocratic upper class circles.